But conversely, don't forget Gaddafi funded and helped the ANC. And who can forget the images of Nelson Mandela going to Tripoli and praising. This is a man that many of us admire. And Nelson Mandela is a great friend of Colonel Gaddafi and talks very highly about him because of the help that the Libyan government gave to the ANC. Now, I remember, I'm a Conservative member of Parliament, but I remember my concerns about Margaret Thatcher at the time of the early 80s, when my party were basically saying that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, which I think is an absolute disgrace and scandal. I'm not being prone, as Lord Ahmed will tell you, criticising the Conservative Party, but being a Conservative, but I thought that was wrong, very, very wrong. So we can't just say Colonel Gaddafi only funds terrorists and is a bad person, because in certain cases he's actually supported people, freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela, who have changed the history of the world. Now, the United Kingdom government, however, this is where I've been nice, I've been critical of my own party, I'm going to be critical of the Labour government now. The United Kingdom government, however, this government has not helped when it comes to the issue of terrorism, because on the one hand they say they want to fight a global terrorism, but on the other hand they have released, or they have allowed the release of the convicted bomber of the Lockerbie tragedy. Now, some people in this room may think that that conviction was flawed, that the man was innocent, that he should have been released on health grounds. Interestingly, he is still alive, although we were told that he only had 3 months to live. Now, Mr. Al-Ghamati and I won a debate together in Doha, in Qatar, last year, where the motion was this House deplores the release of the Lockerbie bomber. And in front of a totally Arab audience in Qatar, him and I, we won that argument convincingly. And one of the things that the people said is, you're sending mixed messages. On the one hand, you are saying you want to fight terrorism, and yet you are letting out a convicted bomber. Now, I'm coming towards the end, but I wanted to mention something about P.C. Yvonne Fletcher. I have got very involved with the family of P.C. Yvonne Fletcher whilst writing this book, and feel passionately about their dignity and their suffering during the course of the last 20 years. And I took them to meet with David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary, towards the end of last year. And I have put the Conservative Party on notice that should we be elected to office, I will be doing everything possible to keep pressurising them to get the killer of this serving British police officer. Again, I say to Libya, and those who want to promote relations with Libya, it is an absolute scandal that the killer of this young lady has not been released. Now, the Metropolitan Police have been to Libya on 4 separate occasions, and they are very close to identifying the killer of this British police officer. But the Libyans are obstructing them. If you speak to the Met Office has been prevented from returning to Tripoli to finish their investigations. And I will not be satisfied that Libya is serious about turning away from the mistakes of the past until the killer of this British police woman is returned. And lastly, I want to talk about dissidents. One of the most emotional meetings I had in the course of writing this book was meeting with a young, successful businessman called Ramzi Nafa. His father, Mahmoud Nafa, was a Libyan dissident, and he was shot dead on his doorstep in the early 1980s. Now, Ramzi came to see me. He was 6 years of age when his father was killed. And I had written to the Libyan ambassador on his behalf. He wishes to go to see his 92-year-old grandmother living in Tripoli, and even now he is still being prevented from returning to see his elderly grandmother because he's associated with, through birth, through Mahmoud Nafa, who was this dissident. I say again to the Libyans, and I will continue to say this, if you want to turn the page to a new chapter in relations, I also expect and demand some form of compensation and support for family members of those Libyan dissidents who were killed in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you. very much. And as I mentioned right at the outset, the wonderful work that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch do, and so therefore we've got the next two speakers from Amnesty, Diana Al-Zahawi, who's representing Amnesty International. I'd like her to speak first, and then we'll ask Human Rights Watch.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for Suaad and the Society Outreach for this invitation and for this opportunity for Amnesty International to raise its human rights concerns on Libya. Of course, all of us recognize that Libya's international image and standing on the international arena has been evolving. It's no longer considered a pariah state, it's no longer dubbed as a state sponsoring terrorism. And as with this evolution, many inside Libya had hope that this would be accompanied with greater reform and respect of human rights at home. And this was particularly consolidated because the Libyan authorities were promising reform, but as largely reform enters the discourse today in a way that it hasn't in the past. However, at best, questions remain regarding the pace and the depth of this reform and the lack of transparency in decision-making. There are many concerns that these promises to address the legacy of the past are merely serving as window dressing to improve Libya's international image. And there are also concerns that the international community are going to forego these concerns in the interest of other issues such as the control of irregular migration, combating terrorism, or trade in oil and other such interests. That's why, as Amnesty, we very much welcome the discussion that happened here in the House of Lords about 10 days ago, raising human rights concerns, raising cases of enforced disappearance, like the case of Jabal al-Matar. And we very much hope that the UK and other EU member states will ensure that concrete human rights provisions and measurable benchmarks are included in negotiations with Libya, particularly in the framework of the EU bilateral negotiations with Libya that are ongoing now. So in my presentation, because Joma has already highlighted key human rights concerns, and I'm sure a colleague from Human Rights Watch will do the same. We'll just touch upon some minor issues or some key issues that Amnesty has monitored in the past years, and share some impressions of the organization following our first mission to the country in 5 years in May of last year, which will be then broadly available publicly later this year in a public report. And finally, I'll close with some hopes on changes that we as Amnesty believe are needed to consolidate progress and transform talk of reform into reality. So just to start on a positive note, there are some indications that things are changing in Libya. There are domestic voices talking more freely about the human rights situation. For example, families of victims of the Abu Salim prison incident have been extremely courageous and vocal in demanding their right to justice, to truth about what happened to their relatives, and to reparations. And this in the face of reprisals. Some of them have been briefly imprisoned in March of last year. They are intimidated by the security forces, but they continue to demand for their rights. The Gaddafi Development Foundation, which by no means can be considered an independent organization, has, however, played a role in pushing the debate on human rights, in raising issues that haven't been raised previously, such as enforced disappearances, such as torture, and asking for better institutional framework to enable Libyans to freely express their opinions. However, now we're coming to the reality on the ground. Because despite these initiatives raising hopes, to date security forces enjoy unrestrained powers in a climate of virtually total impunity. To date, individuals are left outside the protection of the law, and such individuals range from from those who are critical or are deemed to be critical of the Libyan political system, to individuals who are deemed to be a security threat, to foreign nationals who are in Libya and who are suspected of being irregular migrants and are held in detention.